I want you to picture something. You're 67 years old, sitting at your daughter's Thanksgiving table, and your own son, in front of your grandchildren, your sister, and 6 other relatives, says, loudly enough for the entire table to hear, "So, Mom, did you find out yet if James is even a real person? Or are we still pretending that's not obviously a scam?" And the entire table goes quiet, and you sit there holding a fork you can no longer make yourself use, understanding that the worst part of what happened to you was never actually the money. It was this exact moment, being humiliated by your own children in front of people you love, for the crime of being lonely enough to believe someone was kind to you. My name is Rosa Delgado. I'm 69 years old now, and 2 years ago, roughly 18 months after my husband Ramon passed away, I lost almost $60,000, a significant portion of our retirement savings, to a man I believed I had fallen in love with online, a man who, as it turned out, did not exist at all. I want to tell you honestly what that experience actually felt like from the inside, not the way it gets described afterward by people who weren't lonely enough themselves to understand how it happens. And I want to tell you about what my own children did in response, which wounded me in ways that, if I'm honest, went even deeper than the financial loss itself. And I want to tell you how all of that eventually led me to rebuild an entire life for myself in a small city called Tagaytay in the Philippines, overlooking a volcano I had never once heard of before. Grief and humiliation together left me needing somewhere entirely new to simply exist without being reminded every single day of exactly how foolish everyone around me now believed me to be. I need to back up, though, because I don't think any of this makes sense without understanding exactly how lonely I actually was, and exactly why I was so ready to believe someone, anyone, when they finally paid attention to me. Ramon and I were married for 41 years in a modest but genuinely happy marriage built in a suburb outside Phoenix, Arizona, where he worked for 36 years as an electrician, and I ran a small bookkeeping service out of our home once our 2 children, Marco and Teresa, were old enough for me to manage the work around their school schedules. Ramon died of pancreatic cancer quickly, within 4 months of his diagnosis, and I want to be honest that the grief that followed was, for the better part of a year, so complete and so isolating that I barely remember the specific texture of most of those early months at all. Marco and Teresa, both grown with their own families by then, checked in regularly during that first year, the way adult children do, phone calls and occasional visits. But both had full lives of their own, careers and children, and the ordinary busyness that eventually, understandably, pulls attention back toward one's own household rather than an aging, grieving parents. I do not blame either of them for this, not entirely, because it is simply the natural shape adult life takes. But I want to be honest that by the time the first anniversary of Ramon's death arrived, I was profoundly, achingly lonely in a way I had not experienced at any previous point across my entire 67 years. It was during that particular stretch, roughly 14 months after Ramon's death, that I joined a Facebook group for widows, initially simply hoping to find some sense of shared experience with other women navigating similar grief. Within that group, I began, gradually, exchanging messages with a man who introduced himself as James Whitfield, an American civil engineer, he told me, currently working on an infrastructure contract in Malaysia, himself recently widowed, with a young daughter being cared for by her grandmother back in the States while he finished his overseas contract. I want to describe as honestly as I can exactly how this began, because I think understanding the actual mechanics of it matters considerably more than simply being told after the fact that I should have known better. James was, from our very first exchange, extraordinarily attentive, remembering small details I'd mentioned in passing, checking in daily, asking thoughtful questions about Ramon, about my children, about the specific shape of my grief, in a way that felt, after over a year of well-meaning but increasingly brief check-in calls from my own children, like being genuinely seen by another person for the first time since Ramon's death. Over the following 4 months, our correspondence deepened considerably. Long messages exchanged daily, occasional voice notes in a warm, articulate voice, plans discussed in increasingly specific detail for him to finally visit once his current contract concluded. I want to be honest that I fell in love with him, or with the version of him I had constructed from months of careful, attentive messages, as completely as I believe I have fallen in love with anyone in my entire life, Ramon included. Precisely because the timing of it, 14 months into a grief so total it had left me barely recognizable to myself, made me almost entirely unable to maintain the healthy skepticism I might otherwise have brought to an online relationship with someone I had genuinely never met in person. I remember in particular one exchange, roughly 2 months into our correspondence, when I mentioned, almost in passing, the specific anniversary of Ramon's diagnosis approaching, a date I had not mentioned to anyone else, including my own children, out of a sense that the specificity of my grief had become somehow burdensome to share aloud. James responded within the hour with a message so thoughtful, so precisely attuned to exactly what that particular date meant to me, that I sat at my kitchen table crying, not from sadness, but from the specific relief of finally being fully seen by someone at a moment when my own children's attention had, understandably, but painfully, moved elsewhere. I understand now, with the particular clarity that only comes afterward, that this exact kind of attentiveness is precisely the mechanism by which these relationships establish their hold. But at the time, it felt like nothing less than the return of genuine intimacy I had believed I would never experience again after losing Ramon. The requests for money began small, and I want to describe the pattern honestly, without providing the specific mechanics in enough detail that anyone could use this account as a how-to guide, because I think that would do a disservice to anyone watching this who might currently be navigating something similar themselves. A minor customs issue that briefly delayed an equipment shipment critical to his contract. A medical emergency involving his daughter back in the States that his own mother, he explained, could not immediately cover. Each request came with an elaborate, plausible explanation, each amount initially modest enough that sending it felt at the time like a reasonable act of care for someone I had come to love, rather than what it actually was. Over the following 8 months, those individual requests accumulated into a sum that still, to this day, causes a physical tightness in my chest when I allow myself to think about it in full. I sold a modest piece of jewelry Ramon had given me for our 30th anniversary. I withdrew funds from an account I had always considered untouchable, meant originally for my eventual long-term care needs. I want to be honest that at no point during those 8 months did I experience the entire arrangement as anything other than genuine, mutual care between two people who had found each other in the midst of shared loss. The unraveling began, as I understand now it so often does, when James finally proposed an actual date for his long-promised visit, and then, within days of that date approaching, presented an emergency requiring an amount considerably larger than anything he had previously requested, involving a supposed legal complication with his final work visa that he explained needed immediate resolution before he could finally travel to see me. Something in the scale and timing of that particular request finally penetrated the fog I had been living inside for the better part of a year, and I did something I had not thought to do at any earlier point in our entire relationship. I searched, specifically and carefully, for any trace of James Whitfield, civil engineer, existing anywhere beyond our own private messages. I found nothing. No employment record with the company he claimed to work for. No trace of the daughter he had described in such loving, specific detail over so many months. A reverse image search on the photographs he had sent me revealed they belonged, in fact, to an entirely different man, a physical therapist in Ohio who, when I eventually found and contacted him directly, informed me, with evident weariness, that his photographs had been used in this exact way by scammers on multiple previous occasions, that he received messages like mine several times a year from women who had believed, as completely as I had, that they were corresponding with him. I want to describe the specific quality of that discovery, because I think it deserves to be understood honestly, rather than simply summarized. It was not merely the financial loss, devastating as that was, that broke something in me that particular evening. It was the complete, retroactive dismantling of an entire relationship I had genuinely believed in. Every conversation, every shared vulnerability about Ramon and my grief, revealed, all at once, to have been performed by someone, or more likely, several different people operating the same account, who had never once actually cared about any of it at all. I contacted my bank the following morning, then the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, then, finally, with considerable dread, my own children. I want to be honest about how each of those conversations actually went, because I think the difference between them matters enormously to the rest of this story. Teresa, my daughter, cried on the phone, genuinely devastated on my behalf, and flew out from her home in Denver within the week to help me navigate the reporting process and simply sit with me through the worst of the immediate aftermath. Marco's reaction was entirely different, and I want to describe it honestly because I believe understanding it matters. His first response, before any expression of concern for my well-being, was a kind of exasperated disbelief that I could have been so gullible, language he used almost immediately and continued using with escalating frequency over the following months. He seemed to experience my victimization less as something that had happened to me and more as an embarrassment that reflected poorly on our entire family, a framing that wounded me nearly as deeply as the scam itself had. The Thanksgiving comment I described at the very beginning of this story happened roughly 5 months after the scam fully unraveled, at a gathering I had genuinely hoped might offer some sense of returning normalcy after months of shame and financial reckoning. Marco's comment, delivered loudly enough for the entire table, including my own grandchildren, to hear, was not, I came to understand, an isolated lapse in judgment, but rather the culmination of months of a pattern in which he had, repeatedly, chosen to publicly relitigate my humiliation, rather than simply support me through recovering from it. I want to describe the specific silence that followed his comment, because I think it captures something important about how family shame operates. Nobody at that table defended me in the moment, not even Teresa, who I believe was simply too shocked by the cruelty of the comment to immediately respond. My own grandchildren, aged 12 and 15, looked between their father and myself with the particular discomfort children display when they sense an adult has said something genuinely unkind, but lack the standing to challenge it themselves. I excused myself from that table within minutes, drove home alone, and sat in my own kitchen for the remainder of that evening, feeling, for the first time in my entire life, genuinely uncertain whether my own son actually respected me at all. I want to be honest that the months following that Thanksgiving were, in their own particular way, harder than the immediate aftermath of discovering the scam itself had been. The financial loss, devastating as it was, existed as a single discrete wound I could begin, slowly, to process and move past. Marco's ongoing pattern of using my victimization as a source of family humor or exasperated commentary, repeated at subsequent gatherings, despite Teresa's occasional attempts to intervene on my behalf, kept the wound perpetually reopened in a way I found genuinely difficult to recover from, while remaining in the same city, attending the same family gatherings, seeing Marco with a regularity that repeatedly triggered the exact humiliation I was otherwise trying to heal from. The pattern continued at my granddaughter's 15th birthday party, roughly 2 months after that Thanksgiving, when Marco, introducing me to a co-worker's wife I had never met before, said, with what I believe he genuinely intended as light, affectionate teasing, "This is my mom, the one who almost married a Malaysian engineer who didn't actually exist." The co-worker's wife laughed, uncertain how else to respond to information delivered so casually, and I stood there, 68 years old, watching my own son introduce me to a stranger through the lens of my worst, most humiliating year, apparently having decided that this particular framing of my own mother had simply become a permanent, acceptable part of his social repertoire. I confronted him directly after that party, pulling him aside before he left, and told him, as calmly as I could manage, given how deeply the moment had wounded me, that I needed him to stop discussing what had happened to me as though it were simply an amusing family anecdote. His response, delivered with genuine confusion rather than any apparent malice, was that he didn't realize it still bothered me that much. Language that told me, more clearly than almost anything else that entire year, exactly how little he had actually considered the ongoing impact of his own repeated commentary on my well-being. I want to describe one particular conversation with Teresa, roughly 7 months after Ramon's death anniversary and the scam's unraveling, because I think it captures the beginning of whatever shift eventually led me toward the decision that would change my life. She called me one evening, apologizing on Marco's behalf in a way that, however well-intentioned, still placed the burden of managing the family's emotional dynamics squarely on me rather than on her brother. "Mom, I know he's been harsh, but I think he's just really worried about you, and he doesn't always know how to say that in a healthy way." I told her, as gently as I could manage, that I understood Marco might genuinely be worried underneath his harshness, but that worry expressed as public humiliation was not something I could continue absorbing indefinitely, regardless of the underlying intention. It was Teresa herself, in fact, who first mentioned the possibility of a completely fresh start somewhere entirely removed from the specific geography of my humiliation, having read, purely by chance, an article about American retirees finding genuine community and affordability in the Philippines. I remember my initial reaction being one of considerable hesitation, uncertain whether I possessed the emotional resilience at 68 years old, freshly humiliated and financially diminished, to build an entirely new life somewhere so unfamiliar. But the idea, once planted, did not fully leave me, the way ideas sometimes take root, specifically in the moments when you are most desperate for any path forward that doesn't involve continuing to attend family gatherings, where your own son treats your worst year as ongoing material for exasperated commentary. I began researching quietly over the following months the retirement visa available to foreigners over 50, the actual cost of living, expat communities across various regions. A city called Tagaytay kept surfacing in my research, a smaller, cooler city built along a ridge overlooking Taal Volcano, described repeatedly as offering a genuinely welcoming retiree community alongside a considerably gentler climate than the more tropical lowland cities further south. After nearly 3 months of quiet research, I decided on something small and containable. A single trip, 10 days, to see the place with my own eyes before committing to anything more permanent. I flew out of Phoenix alone, 68 years old, carrying a grief for Ramon that had never fully resolved, layered now with a fresh, considerable shame that my own son's ongoing commentary had prevented me from ever properly processing. Toward a city I knew almost nothing about beyond what I had read in the preceding months. I landed in Manila first, spent one disoriented night adjusting to the heat and noise every visitor to that airport seems to experience, and then took a 2-hour drive south to Tagaytay, where a woman named Marilou connected to me through the same online expat forums where I'd spent months quietly asking questions, had offered to meet me and show me around for a few days. An act of generosity from a total stranger that struck me, even then, as almost unbelievable, given how thoroughly a supposed act of care from a stranger had already once devastated me. Marilou met me at a small transport terminal, and the city itself, considerably cooler and greener than the heat I'd braced myself for, based on everything I'd read about the Philippines generally, surprised me immediately. A genuine ridgetop town with a climate that reminded me, faintly and unexpectedly, of early autumn evenings back in Arizona before the desert heat had fully set in for the year. Marilou put me up in a modest guest house for those first several days, and on my second evening there, took me to a restaurant with an unobstructed view of Taal Volcano, sitting in the middle of its own lake. A view so unexpectedly striking that I found myself, for the first time in over a year, sitting in complete silence, simply absorbing something beautiful, rather than turning over the specific texture of my own humiliation. Marilou, over the following days, shared her own story with a frankness I hadn't anticipated from someone I'd known barely 48 hours. She had, years earlier, lost a modest inheritance to a fraudulent investment scheme run by a cousin she had trusted completely, and had endured in the aftermath a similar pattern of family members treating her victimization as evidence of poor judgment rather than simply bad fortune. In my experience, she told me over dinner one evening, the people who judge you hardest for being deceived are almost always the ones who have never yet been tested themselves. They believe their own good judgment protects them completely, so they need to believe your lack of judgment explains what happened to you, because the alternative, that it could happen to anyone, including them, is too frightening for them to sit with. I toured a modest hospital during that visit, mostly out of the same practical instinct that had led me to actually verify every detail of my own finances so thoroughly once the scam finally came to light, and found the costs, when I inquired directly, considerably lower than anything comparable back in the United States. A fact that mattered enormously, given how significantly my retirement savings had been depleted by everything that had happened. By the end of that 10-day trip, I knew, in the particular quiet way you know something before you fully admitted it to yourself in words, that I needed to rebuild whatever remained of my life somewhere entirely removed from the specific geography of my own humiliation. I flew home to Phoenix and spent nearly 3 months finalizing the practical details, the visa paperwork, the sale of my house, a process made considerably more painful by having to sort through 41 years of belongings shared with Ramon, while simultaneously fielding Marco's continued, if somewhat more muted, skepticism about the entire plan. I told both my children about my decision separately. Teresa was immediately supportive, having been the one to first suggest the idea in the first place, though she expressed genuine sadness at the physical distance the move would create between us. Marco's reaction, predictably, carried an undertone of the same exasperated concern that had characterized his response to the scam itself, a suggestion that perhaps I was running away from my problems instead of dealing with them. Language that struck me, given everything that had already transpired, as a particularly unfair characterization of a decision aimed specifically at finally healing from problems he himself had spent the better part of a year actively preventing me from processing. I flew out on a one-way ticket roughly 5 months after that initial trip, 68 years old, toward a life I could not have fully imagined for myself even a single year earlier, carrying with me both the ongoing grief of losing Ramon and a fresh, considerable wound regarding my own son's treatment of my worst year, alongside a genuine hope that distance and an entirely new community might allow me to finally begin healing from both. The small house I arranged, modest but comfortable, sat on the outskirts of Tagaytay proper, close enough to walk into the main commercial area, but offering the specific quiet I badly needed after everything I'd endured. Marilou met me at the transport terminal again, this time with a small bouquet of flowers, helping me settle in over those first difficult days. I want to be honest that the first several months were harder than my brief visit had prepared me for. The particular disorientation of grieving both a husband and, in a slower, more insidious way, my own son's basic respect for me, in a place where I knew almost no one and understood almost nothing about the daily rhythms of ordinary life. There were mornings I woke in that unfamiliar house and simply lay there, replaying Marco's Thanksgiving comment with a clarity that suggested the wound had traveled with me across an entire ocean, rather than remaining safely behind in Arizona. What began to change things, gradually, was Marilou's introduction, about 2 months in, to a small group of women who gathered most Saturday mornings at a modest cafe overlooking the volcano. Several of them, I discovered with a particular shock of recognition, having navigated their own versions of financial deception or family shame in the aftermath. A woman named Corazon, in particular, had lost a modest sum to a similar online relationship scam several years earlier, and listened to my full story when I finally felt able to share it completely, with an understanding that went considerably beyond simple sympathy. You are not foolish for wanting to be loved after losing your husband, she told me, taking my hand across that small cafe table. You are only foolish if you let one bad experience convince you that wanting love again was itself the mistake. About 8 months into my time in Tagaytay, I had a health scare that tested in a very concrete way whether the fragile new community I built here could actually hold up under real pressure. I fainted one afternoon while walking home from the market, the heat and a missed meal combining into something the hospital later attributed to low blood sugar and mild dehydration. Nothing life-threatening, but frightening enough in the moment, collapsing on an unfamiliar street in a country where I still knew relatively few people well. A tricycle driver who happened to be passing, a young man named Jun-jun, stopped immediately, and within minutes had flagged down 2 other passers-by to help get me into his vehicle and to the nearest clinic, refusing any payment for the ride when I tried, groggily, to offer it once I'd regained full consciousness. Marilou arrived at the clinic within 20 minutes of my call, and Corazon came directly after, sitting with me through the several hours of monitoring the doctors insisted on, given my age. I remember lying on that examination table, 69 years old, surrounded by women who had known me for less than a year, and thinking, with a specific, aching clarity, about that Thanksgiving table, about a son who had turned my worst experience into recurring material for casual jokes, set against strangers who had simply, immediately, without hesitation, made sure I was safe. The contrast was not something I could easily set aside. It was through that same group of women that I discovered an opportunity that ended up giving my entire new life its shape and purpose. Marilou mentioned one Saturday morning that a local community organization was looking for volunteers to help run a basic digital literacy and online safety program aimed specifically at older residents in the area, many of whom had children working overseas and relied heavily on messaging apps and social media to stay connected, making them, as I understood only too well by then, particularly vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation I myself had experienced. I said yes almost before Marilou had finished describing it, recognizing immediately the strange, painful symmetry of transforming my own worst experience into something that might protect other lonely people from enduring the exact same devastation. The very first session, sitting across from perhaps a dozen older residents, many of them widows and widowers themselves. I found myself for the first time since that Thanksgiving table, discussing my own experience not as a source of shame to be hidden, but as hard-won knowledge that might genuinely help someone else avoid the same fate. There was one woman in particular, a quiet widower in her early 70s, named Nanay Bening, whose son worked overseas and had recently expressed concern that she was corresponding online with someone she'd met through a mutual church group's social media page. Someone whose story, once Nanay Bening described the details to me privately after a session, bore several unsettling similarities to my own experience with James. I walked her through, gently and without judgment, the specific pattern I had come to recognize far too late in my own situation. And when she returned 3 weeks later to tell me she had discovered, through careful verification, that the relationship was indeed fraudulent, she thanked me with a depth of gratitude that made the entire painful process of rebuilding my own life here feel, for the first time, genuinely worthwhile in a way I hadn't expected to feel again so soon. About 10 months into my time in Tagaytay, Teresa came to visit, her first time seeing the actual life I had built, rather than hearing about it through increasingly hopeful phone calls. She landed curious rather than worried, having remained supportive throughout the entire process, and I showed her everything. The digital literacy program, where Nanay Bening greeted her warmly and told her unprompted at some length about everything her mother had taught the group about protecting themselves online. Marilou and Corazon and the Saturday morning cafe gatherings that had become the backbone of my new life. The moment that moved her most happened on her 3rd day, sitting in on one of my sessions, watching me walk a room full of people considerably more vulnerable than I had once believed myself to be, through the exact warning signs that, had I recognized them myself, might have spared me an entire year of devastation and humiliation. Afterward, walking back to my house, Teresa was quiet for a long stretch before saying, "Mom, you've turned the worst thing that ever happened to you into something that's actually protecting people. I don't think Marco has ever once considered that possibility." I told her that I hadn't set out to do anything particularly noble, that I had simply needed somewhere to put the pain that didn't involve continuing to be treated by my own family as a cautionary tale, rather than a person still capable of contributing something genuinely useful. On her last evening, sitting on my small porch, overlooking the distant silhouette of Taal Volcano, Teresa said something I will likely remember for the rest of my life. "I should have said something at that Thanksgiving table, Mom. I've regretted my silence every day since." I told her honestly that I appreciated her saying so now, and that I understood, in the moment, shock had likely rendered her as speechless as it had rendered everyone else at that table, myself included. She has, in the time since that visit, become considerably more willing to directly challenge Marco whenever the subject resurfaces. A small but genuine shift that I have come to value enormously. Marco, I want to be honest, has not visited, and our relationship remains, as of this recording, considerably more distant than I would ever have chosen for myself. Occasional brief phone calls and email exchange around holidays, nothing resembling genuine reconciliation. I do not know whether that relationship will ever recover the closeness we once shared before any of this happened, and I have made a difficult peace over these past 2 years with the real possibility that it may not, at least not until he is willing to genuinely reckon with the specific cruelty of how he chose to respond to my worst year, rather than simply continuing to expect me to move past it on his behalf. I am 69 years old now, having lost a significant portion of my retirement savings to a man who never existed at all, and having discovered in the aftermath that my own son's judgment wounded me nearly as deeply as the deception itself had. My monthly expenses here in Tagaytay, rent, food, the modest supplies I occasionally bring to the digital literacy sessions, come to somewhere around 38,000 pesos, just under $700, comfortably covered by what remains of my Social Security and the reduced but still meaningful portion of my retirement savings the scam did not manage to take, with the cooler climate here meaning I spend considerably less adjusting to heat than I anticipated when I first began researching this move. I think often about that Thanksgiving table, about the specific public cruelty of being humiliated by your own child for the crime of having been lonely enough to believe someone was finally paying genuine attention to you. I do not believe that particular wound has fully healed, and I have stopped expecting it to on any particular timeline. But I have learned, at an age when most people assume every major lesson of their life is already behind them, that being deceived does not make you foolish, and that the people who judge you most harshly for it are very often simply protecting themselves from having to imagine the same thing happening to them. I have found, in a small city overlooking a volcano I had never once heard of before any of this happened, a version of the exact same warmth and attentiveness I once believed I had found with a man who never existed at all. Except this time, it is entirely real, built with women who understood my exact particular shame without ever once needing it fully explained to them. If there is one thing I would want another woman watching this, sitting somewhere right now carrying her own version of that Thanksgiving table silence to understand, it is this: loneliness is not a character flaw, and being deceived by someone skilled at exploiting it does not make you a fool. You are allowed to grieve what was taken from you, both the money and the dignity, and you are also allowed at the very same time to build something entirely new from whatever remains. Somewhere nobody treats your worst year as material for a joke. If this story meant something to you, I would be grateful if you would like this video and subscribe. There are more stories like mine, and I believe you will find them worth your time. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I will see you in the next.